Why is 95% of Australia empty? This is Australia, the sixth largest country in the world, a land so vast that you could fit multiple large nations inside it. From the outside, it looks like a continent full of possibilities. Endless land, open space, natural resources. But the reality is very different. Even today, nearly 95% of Australia is practically empty. If you look at a population map, you will notice something unusual. Almost all the people are clustered along the edges, on the eastern, southeastern, and southwestern coasts. Cities like Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide carry the majority of the population. But the moment you move away from these coastal zones and step into the interior, everything changes. The land becomes quieter, harsher, and far more difficult to survive in. In fact, the deeper you go inside Australia, the lower your chances of survival become. So the question is, bang, why? Why would such a massive and resource-rich country remain so empty? At first, it feels like a geographical mystery. But when you start digging deeper, you realize that the story is not just about nature. It is also about history. And not just any history. A painful, often ignored past that shaped the country long before modern Australia existed. Because the truth is, Australia was not always empty. Before borders were drawn, before maps were created this land was home to one of the oldest continuous civilizations in human history, the Aboriginal people. For tens of thousands of years, they lived across this continent, in ways modern science is still trying to full grasp. They didn't just survive, they adapted. They hunted, gathered, and moved with the seasons. They knew where water could be found, even in the harshest regions. They used natural resources carefully, without exhausting them. But what truly made their culture different was their relationship with land. To them, land was not something you owned. It was something you belonged to. There were no fences, no property lines, no concept of buying and selling land. Their identity, their stories, their spirituality, everything was connected to the land. And that difference in thinking would later become one of the biggest reasons for what happened next. Because while Aboriginal communities were living in balance with nature, the rest of the world was entering a very different phase. The 17th and 18th centuries were the age of exploration. European powers were expanding across the globe, searching for land, resources, and control, and eventually colonized. And then, in 1788, the British arrived in Australia. They landed at Botany Bay, now modern-day Sydney. At first, the encounter seemed peaceful. The local communities did not see them as a threat. They had no concept of invasion in the way Europeans practiced it. But the British saw something else entirely. They saw land, untouched, unclaimed tam, at least by their legal standards. And that's when they introduced a concept that would change everything. No one had officially claimed ownership of the land. It could be taken. And just like that, an entire continent was redefined. Not as a home, but as an opportunity. But the British didn't come alone. They brought with them convicts, prisoners, people who had committed crimes and were sent away as punishment. Australia became a penal colony. At first, the British only occupied small areas. They asked for limited land. They created the impression of cooperation. But slowly, that changed. Settlements expanded. Fences were built. More land was claimed. And to the original inhabitants shrank. For the Aboriginal communities, this was not just about losing land. It was about losing survival itself, because their entire way of life depended on access to nature. They needed land to hunt, to gather food, to find water, to sustain their culture. And now, that access was being taken away. But even this was not the worst part. Because along with the British came something invisible, something far more deadly. Infections that had never existed on this land before. The Aboriginal population had no exposure to these diseases, which meant they had no immunity. And when these diseases spread, they spread rapidly. Entire communities were affected within months. In some regions, up to 50% of the population died within a single year. Imagine that. Half the population now, gone. Not because of war, not because of natural disaster, but because of diseases they had never encountered before. And what makes this even more disturbing is that the people who brought these diseases often had access to treatment. But that treatment was not provided equally. Many indigenous communities were left without help, left to suffer, left to die. And as their numbers declined, their resistance weakened, their land became easier to take, and their future became uncertain. At the same time, British control continued to grow. More settlements appeared, more land was fenced, more restrictions were imposed. Aboriginal people were no longer allowed to freely move across their own territories. They could not hunt where they once hunted. They could not access water where they once survived. They were being pushed out calms, slowly but steadily. And as pressure increased, so did anger. Because people can only be pushed so far before they respond. And soon, that response would turn into resistance. A resistance that would change Australia forever. As pressure on Aboriginal communities continued to grow, resistance became inevitable. By the late 18th century, tensions had reached a breaking point. Around 1795, conflicts between Aboriginal groups and British settlers began to turn into open resistance. What started as small clashes slowly evolved into a long and brutal struggle. This was not a single war. It was a series of conflicts spread across different regions of Australia. Historians often refer to this period as the Frontier Wars. And unlike organized battles between two armies, this was far more chaotic and uneven. On one side, there were indigenous communities already weakened by disease, displacement, and loss of resources. On the other side, there were British settlers equipped with firearms, structured systems, and growing support from the Empire. The outcome was tragically predictable. But what makes this part of history so disturbing is not just the violence, it is the scale of destruction. Entire tribes were wiped out. Communities that had existed for thousands of years disappeared within decades. In many cases, resistance was met with extreme retaliation. Mass killings took place. People were driven off their land. Others were forced into labor under harsh conditions. And as these conflicts continued year after year, the population decline became impossible to ignore. By the time the early 1900s arrived, the Aboriginal population had collapsed by nearly 90%. From an estimated population of millions before colonization, only tens of thousands remained. Think about the scale of that loss. This wasn't just a decline. It was the near erasure of a civilization. A culture that had survived for tens of thousands of years was pushed to the edge of extinction in less than 150 years. But even after this devastation, the transformation of Australia was still ongoing. Because as indigenous populations declined, new groups of people began arriving. Migrants from Europe, Asia, and other regions came to Australia for trade, labor, and settlement. This created the impression that the population was growing. And in numbers, it was. But this growth did not reflect the reality of what had been lost. Because the original inhabitants the Aboriginal people held were no longer a major part of that population. They had been pushed to the margins, socially, economically, and geographically. And then came another major turning point, global wars. When World War I began in 1914, Australia, as part of the British Empire, was drawn into the conflict. Thousands of Australian men were sent overseas to fight in Europe and other battlefields. Many of them never returned. In fact, a significant percentage of the country's young male population was lost during this war. And just as the country was trying to recover, World War II began. Once again, Australia was involved. Once again, lives were lost. But this time, the war came closer to home. There were direct attacks on Australian territory, especially in the northern regions. Air raids, military threats, fear and uncertainty spread across the country. And once again, the population, especially the working-age male population suffered. So by the mid-20th century, Australia had already gone through multiple waves of population loss. First disease. Second long-term conflict and violence. Third global wars. Each of these factors weakened population growth in different ways. But there was still one more factor that shaped modern Australia in a very controlled way. Government policy. In 1901, Australia introduced the Immigration Restriction Act to control who could enter and settle in Australia. Non-European immigrants, especially from Asia, were heavily restricted. It limited population diversity. It controlled population growth, and it ensured that migration remained selective rather than open. So even though Australia had vast amounts of land, the number of people allowed to settle there remained limited. Now, if you connect all these factors together, a clear pattern begins to emerge. Australia did not become empty overnight. It became empty over time, through a combination of destruction, loss, and restriction. First, diseases wiped out large portions of the indigenous population. Then, decades of conflict reduced their numbers even further. After that, global wars impacted the remaining population. And finally, immigration policies controlled how much the population could grow. Today, Australia has a population of around 26 million people. But when you compare that number to the size of the country, it is still extremely low. And the indigenous population, the original inhabitants of this land, make up only a small percentage of that total. A powerful reminder of everything that happened in the past. But even after understanding all this, one question still remains unanswered. If Australia's population has recovered to some extent, then why is most of the country still empty today? Why are people still concentrated in just a few coastal cities? Why hasn't the interior been developed in the same way? To answer that, we need to shift our focus away from history and look at something even more powerful: geography. So far, we've understood how history reduced Australia's population. But history alone doesn't explain why even today, most of the country remains empty. For that, we need to look at something even more powerful than human decisions. Because Australia is not just big, it is extremely unforgiving. At a glance, it may look like a single continuous landmass. But in reality, Australia is divided into 3 major geographical regions, and each of them presents a different kind of challenge for human survival. The first region is the Western Plateau. This covers nearly 2/3 of the entire country. And it is dominated by deserts, vast stretches of dry land. Water sources are rare, vegetation is minimal, and for most people, long-term survival in such conditions is nearly impossible. This is why large portions of Western Australia remain almost completely uninhabited. Now let's move to the second region tool, the Central Lowlands. At first glance, this area might seem more promising. It is lower in elevation, and in some places, it even has river systems. But there's a major problem. The water here is often too salty. Over millions of years, the soil and rocks in this region have developed high levels of salinity. As these rocks break down, the salt seeps into nearby water sources, which means rivers and groundwater are not suitable for drinking or farming. And without fresh water, large-scale human settlement becomes extremely difficult. Even agriculture struggles to survive here. Now comes the third region, the Eastern Highlands. This is the most habitable part of Australia. It stretches along the eastern side of the continent and includes mountain ranges, forests, and relatively fertile land. This is where most of Australia's population lives today. Cities like Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane are all located in or near this region. Because here, conditions are comparatively better. There is access to fresh water, the soil is more fertile, and rainfall is more consistent. But even this region is not completely safe. Let's break this down. First, droughts. A large part of Australia receives very little rainfall. One of the main reasons is its position relative to global wind patterns and ocean currents. The southern part of Australia is influenced by cold waters coming from Antarctica. Cold water does not evaporate easily. And without evaporation, clouds do not form. No clouds mean no rain. This is why massive portions of Australia remain dry for long. In fact, around 70% of the country is classified as arid or semi-arid, which means it is naturally prone to drought. Now let's look at the second challenge, floods. This might sound surprising. How can a country that suffers from drought also experience floods? The answer lies in the eastern coastline. Warm ocean currents from the Pacific Ocean bring moisture toward Australia. When this moist air reaches land, clouds begin to form. But here's the key factor: the Great Dividing Range. This is a long mountain chain running along the eastern side of the country. When clouds hit these mountains, they are forced to rise. As they rise, they cool down and release moisture in the form of heavy rainfall. This is why the eastern regions receive most of the rain. But sometimes, this process becomes too intense. Too much moisture, too much rainfall, and that's when flooding begins. Entire regions can be submerged, infrastructure gets damaged, and life becomes extremely difficult. Now comes the third challenge, the cyclones. Australia lies close to the equator, where ocean temperatures are higher. Warm water fuels storm systems. When conditions align, these storms can grow into powerful cyclones. Strong winds, heavy rain, massive destruction. And these are not rare events. Every year, Australia faces multiple cyclones, especially in its northern and eastern regions. So now, imagine trying to build a life in such conditions. There is no water. In another, the water is too salty. In another, extreme weather keeps destroying everything. Would people choose to live there? Most wouldn't. And that is exactly what we see today. People naturally settle in areas where survival is easier, where water is available, where climate is stable, where infrastructure can be maintained. And in Australia, those areas are limited, which is why almost the entire population is concentrated along a few coastal regions. Vast interior remains empty. So when we put everything together, the picture becomes clear. Australia is not empty because people don't want to live there. It is empty because most of the land does not allow easy survival. History reduced the population. Geography restricted where people could live. And climate continues to make expansion difficult. That is the real reason why 95% of Australia remains empty even today. If you enjoyed this video and want more such deep, reality-based explanations, make sure to subscribe, because the world is full of stories that are far more complex than they appear on the surface. And if you found Australia surprising, wait until you explore places like Mongolia, where almost the entire country feels empty, but the story behind it is just as fascinating. Because sometimes, the emptiest places on Earth hold the deepest truths.